If you're one of the brave souls that has been watching my videos for a while now, or at least if you've watched some of my last videos, you know that I actively advocate for a reboot both of the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG and the anime in conjunction. I've been bringing that up for a while now, but I've especially been more vocal about it since Konami started announcing that they're working on a reboot of the original anime. The reason I've been so vocal about that, especially more recently in pretty much all of my videos, is because I don't think there is any point at all in rebooting the original anime with the current game the way it is. And I know that if they reboot the anime once, I know that if they do this once, they're not really going to do it again. So I do see this as like a once in a lifetime opportunity for the game, and honestly to save the game, quote unquote, in my opinion. The thing with this though is that I probably haven't done the best job of explaining exactly what I mean by a reboot, because every time I bring this up, there's always at least one or two comments of people kind of thinking that I'm talking about a reset. They don't seem to get quite what I mean. And I don't really think that that's their fault necessarily, it's probably just the fact that I haven't really elaborated on this too much. So what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to elaborate on that and explain how I think that a reboot should actually happen, because there's very specific things that need to happen in order for it to work. And one of those things is not a reset, which is what a lot of people think I'm saying. If you've been watching my videos for a while now, you've heard me talk a lot about, Yu-Gi-Oh! Having gone worst and how I missed the Duel Monsters era and that art style and how the game used to work. So when I bring up rebooting the game, naturally, probably a lot of people think, okay, well, we just want to roll back the clock to Duel Monsters era, right? But the thing is that even at that time, there were a lot of problems. I brought this up on my last video talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! Where I feel like a reboot of the anime could be very important for the little Timmies to get back into the game. And not only the little Timmies, but the 40-year-old electrician Toms as well, as I call them. I'm of the belief that a reset of the anime is going to have a similar effect as to Master Duel, where you're going to get some new people interested in the game and a lot of returning players that are going to come check it out because of that, but they're going to drop off really soon once they realize that it has nothing to do with the current game, or the current game is just not what they remember. The problem that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has had for a while now is that we don't get new blood. Not a lot of new people pick up Yu-Gi-Oh! I've talked about this at length. I'm not going to get into why that is again. There's a video that I made that I'll link here that you can go watch if you want to know every single one of my opinions of what's quote-unquote wrong with the game. That's not the point of this video. But a big problem with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that it doesn't get new blood, and a lot of the returning players who came back because of something like Master Duel dropped off soon after because the current game just sucks. That's just the truth. So this is the point of the conversation where there will usually be someone that brings up speed duels. It's usually brought up within different contexts, right? Sometimes people are just curious about my opinion about speed duels in general, asking if I like it or if I don't. Other times people will say, well, hey, Konami already tried to do a reboot of the game. That's what Speed Duels was, and it didn't work very well. Don't you like Speed Duels? Don't you feel like that was a good attempt at a reboot? Like, we've already done this, it didn't work. My answer to that is that I appreciate that Speed Duels exist. I appreciate what they attempted to accomplish. I appreciate them trying to expand the IP in general and make new stuff. I appreciate that. I think it's a cool idea. And I don't hate Speed Duels either. I think it's okay. I think it's fine. Especially when it first came out, I played a little bit of it. But nowadays, the extent of my playtime with Speed Duels is every now and again when I gotta use the bathroom, I'll play Speed Duels. That's kind of it. Speed Duels are not what I would consider a reboot of the game. I consider Speed Duels almost like a spin-off of the game, right? It's its own game, its own little thing. And it's fine that it exists, but it's not a reboot of the game. When I talk about rebooting the game, at least for me, when I'm calling for it, there is a list of very specific things that I would like to see happen. And changing the rules of the game is not one of those things, and that's why I don't consider Speed Duels a reboot, because it is its own game. It changes the rules. That's not what I'm calling for at all. What I am more calling for, in essence, is Duel Monsters 2.0. So what does that mean exactly? What does that actually look like? Number one is having the extra deck going back to being just fusions. That means getting rid of synchros, XYZs, pendulums, links, everything that is not either a ritual summon or a fusion summon. All of that I would like to see go away. There's a few different reasons for that, but I'm going to focus more in a general sense because I think there are things that are negative or positive about every single one of those types of summon that we could get into, but I'm not going to do that. A big problem is I feel that most of them have trivialized the idea of what a fusion summon is supposed to be. And I'm well aware that there still are decks that use fusion summon and that there are decks that still use rituals, but it's almost like it became that deck's gimmick. It's not something that's common. Fusion summons and ritual summons, which were part of the original Duel Monsters game, are no longer a common thing for every deck to have. It is much more common for a deck to use something like links, and back in Edison days, right, 2010, it was much more common for a deck to use something like synchros. I also think that some of them, like Synchros, have escaped from the original Duel Monsters premise. Synchros became a thing for the 5Ds anime, which had a very specific thing, right? They were racing while they played the game, and the whole idea of tuners and synchros was supposed to be like you're tuning your car, you're tuning your monsters. It was all like racing inspired, which is not a Yu-Gi-Oh thing. It was a very specific 5Ds thing. That is the aesthetic side of it, but it's not just about the aesthetic. That is also the point where I believe Yu-Gi-Oh started getting way too fast. And this is coming from somebody that loves Edison format, right? I've done a video talking about how 2010 was the best year to be alive and play Yu-Gi-Oh! When I think about all the formats that I play and have played in the past, and the vast majority of time that I've spent consuming Yu-Gi-Oh!, 90% of it was probably Edison and continues to be. I very much love that format. I grew up with it and I was competing at that time where it was happening, so there's even a nostalgia component to it. But even I, somebody who absolutely loves Edison and loves that era and has nostalgia for it and grew up with it, even I can recognize that this was kind of the beginning of the problems with Yu-Gi-Oh! This is the era and the point of the game where I believe Yu-Gi-Oh! Started getting a little bit too fast. And honestly, compared to current Yu-Gi-Oh!, compared to links and everything that we have going on right now, synchros are actually a blessing. Synchros were just fine in comparison to what we have going on now. So I don't really have this huge problem with them necessarily. I'm a big fan of a lot of the archetypes of that time too, like X-Sabers, Six Samurai. The name of this channel is Uruz because X-Saber Uruz is my favorite card, right? So my favorite card of the entire game is from that era even. But the way I see it, a reboot is not so much about what I have a problem with, what I like and what I don't like. It's about bringing the game back to its essence, and I don't think that synchros are part of that essence. And I don't even think we need to get into XYZs, pendulums, and links, because it's pretty much the same idea, similar problem that I have with them. Another general problem that I have is, especially pendulums and links, is when returning players look at current Yu-Gi-Oh! And the way that it's played, the main thing that turns them off is usually pendulums and links. That is the point where a lot of people quit playing the game. And that is also a wall where a lot of people look at that and they're like, okay, this is not the game I remember, it's unrecognizable, I don't want to get into this anymore. Aside from just the general problems that these cards and these summoning mechanics have inherently, right? What I'm saying is they also operate as a wall. Returning players often don't want to return to the game because they get intimidated by all these new different types of mechanics and things that they don't remember and don't recognize. And that is also aside from the fact that they too do not fit the original Duel Monsters theme. They also trivialize fusion summons and ritual summons inherently. So a reboot to me would also involve getting rid of all of that. If it's not ritual summon, if it's not fusions, it shouldn't be there. Okay, so at this point you're really just rolling back the clock, which is exactly what you said you weren't talking about. At this point it goes back to being a reset, right? You're just going back to GOAT era. Because what it sounds like you're saying is, let's just get rid of anything that was synchros and after, right? Why is that not a reset at that point? How is that any different from just rolling back the clock to GOAT or something like that, which would just be a reset? What exactly makes that a reboot? And the answer to that is, this is only one of the problems being addressed here. The next main problem we need to address is the actual Duel Monsters era itself. Because although the Duel Monsters era was fantastic and, you know, there is merit to that era in itself, I do think there are a lot of problems with that era as well, which this would be addressing. We don't want to just roll things back and go back to one of those formats that they had going on at that time, because even during that time, there were awful formats in place also. I'm not trying to change the rules of the game, which is where I think Rush Duels failed. It's not that Rush Duels failed, it's just if the goal of Rush Duels was for it to be a reboot of the game, it failed in this sense. Because by changing the rules and creating a different game, what you essentially did is you created a different cool game, but you didn't really reboot the actual game that everybody likes playing, right? That's my point with Rush Duels. There's nothing really wrong with it, but it's not really Yu-Gi-Oh! In my opinion. It's like a different game. I get that it uses the same IP, it's in the same vein, and it tries to improve on a few things, but that's not what I want. I don't want to change the rules. So what do you want to see happen? Well, let's start with a few examples like Celtic Garden, Beaver Warriors, Sagi the Dark Clown, like Kaiba's iconic card. All of these cards are very cool and very iconic for their time. The problem though is that they're basically glorified cannon fodder. They don't serve a purpose. The main one that comes to mind to me is Celtic Garden. There's a ton of other examples we could use, but let's just focus on Celtic Garden for the sake of argument here. So Celtic Garden is a very iconic card that Yugi uses all the time. It's almost like a Charmander or a Bulbasaur from the original Yu-Gi-Oh! IP. The problem that I have with a card like Celtic Garden is that it doesn't serve much of a purpose. The only purpose that this card has ever served, and the reason why it became iconic, other than for the fact that it just looks cool, is the fact that Yugi made use of it all the time. Yugi used it all the time. But in practice, unfortunately, it's a pretty bad card, even for that time. Like 1400 attack and 1000 or 1200 defense, I think it was what it was, is not a useful card now or ever, right? So my point would be a rework of this card. It wouldn't just be reprinting Celtic Garden for the sake of nostalgia and just leaving him exactly the way it was. Unless there is a very specific reason why you're doing that, right? Kind of what they did to the Dark Magician support, right? Dark Magician has never changed. They never made a Dark Magician with a different effect. Now I know they've made other versions of the Dark Magician via like Fusion, XYZs and whatnot that are like an attempt of a revamping of that card. But generally speaking, they didn't make a revamped version of the Dark Magician like they did with Gaia or Buster Blader, for example, or Blackluster Soldier. They didn't release a Dark Magician 2.0. Why? Because they built an archetype around that normal monster. Even though Dark Magician is a very basic card and it's the exact same card it always was, the support made it a thing. It made it an important card. They built a whole ecosystem around this specific card to the point where they didn't have to really touch it. And that's kind of what I'm saying about Celtic Garden. I don't think that would be the best card to do that with, but I'm just saying the only reason to reprint and not change them would be if you were doing something like that. If you're doing some sort of like support for that specific card, like multiple cards in the deck somehow interact with him to the point where he doesn't need an effect. In that very specific case, that would be fine, but generally speaking, I would like to see him be rebooted and reworked. Whether that means changing his stats, right? Making him a 1900 attack monster with no effect, right? Just giving him more attack and more defense. Or whether it be turning him into an effect monster. It doesn't really matter. The point is making him relevant in some way. Whether it's still just raw damage normal monster with no effect, as long as that makes him relevant within the context of how that game is being played, that's fine. There's nothing specifically that needs to be touched about him. It's more about what we're going to build around him. I'm using this one card as an example, but I'm talking about doing this with every single card of the game. And that's what I mean by Duel Monsters 2.0. It's not just reprinting the same exact cards and rolling back to the same game that we had. It's actually rebooting these cards with their iconic look and feel, but giving them an actual purpose. Oh, but Celtic Garden was never a good card. It was never used in competitive. That's fine. That's what we're changing. We do want him to be competitive. Okay, but isn't that what they're already doing with modern Yu-Gi-Oh, right? They did that with Buster Blader. They did that with the Dark Magician support. They did that with Blackluster Soldier. They did that with Gaia. Isn't that what they're already doing? Yes, that is absolutely what they're already doing, and in fact, that is one of my favorite things that they have been doing. The problem though is that they have to be tuned for the modern game. The problem is not the fact that they have been doing that. The problem is the fact that they have to retune them in such a way that they become relevant in the modern game. And the real root of the problem here is not the rebooting of the card itself, it's the game, because the reboot of the card is going to have to be relevant for the current game. So that's great that they're rebooting Blue Eyes White Dragon, right? They're doing a support for that deck, or if they reboot Red Eyes or whatever, that's all great. I think it's very cool. But it becomes irrelevant once you reintroduce those cards now with modern game standards if the modern game sucks, which it does. My point being, I wish that we could reboot something like Celtic Garden and not have to turn him into something like Mathmech Circular. It becomes pointless in rebooting these cards, and it just becomes nostalgia bait when you're reintroducing them into a game where they were never relevant to begin. You get someone that used to play the game and doesn't play anymore. They see, wow, Blue Eyes White Dragon is still relevant now. Great, that's going to get me back into the game. I want to play it. I want to play with the Blue Eyes deck. And then you go to play with the Blue Eyes deck and you're welcomed by 20-step combos, Omni Negates, Unbreakable Boards. That doesn't fix the problem. So in essence, yes, they are kind of already doing that, but they're doing it for the wrong reasons. They're doing it to nostalgia bait. They're not fixing the actual problem, which is the game that they're being reintroduced into. Whereas with a reboot, when you reintroduce these cards, the current game is more in line to the era where they used to be relevant in, while also allowing that card to, for the first time ever, actually be possibly relevant in competitive play. There are a few things that are overly simple about the Duel Monsters era, which is why, again, we're not doing a reset, we're doing a reboot. It's a 2.0. It's like a better version of the original game. It's in that spirit, in that vein, but with a lot of things that we have improved over the years. It's also, again, about making these cards relevant, like Saggy the Dark Clown. He attacks 800 and defends 1600 with no effect. That card literally serves no purpose. Why does it have to be that way? We don't want to just reprint Saggy and keep him the exact same way and make him irrelevant.
relevant. No, we probably want to give them an effect. We probably want to reboot them within some sort of archetype or some sort of context. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, now what else do we need to fix? Well, we need to fix the pacing of the game. The game used to have a lot of back and forth. We don't want games that get decided on turn one. We don't want unbreakable boards. We don't want omni negates. We got to get rid of all of that. The game would have to be rebooted in such a way where it's not completely like quote-unquote caveman Yu-Gi-Oh, where the game is uber simple, normal cards with no effects. But I don't think that that necessarily has to mean something like Tearlaments. I don't think that that has to look like Snake Eye. I do think that there is a happy medium where we can reboot and make use of the original IP and make use of these classic cards and actually give them a purpose without completely rolling back the clock and making the game overly simple or overly dumb. While also not crossing the line where the game becomes, again, 20-step combos, omni negates, and unbreakable boards. There is a happy medium there. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Absolutely, we want to maintain some classic things. We want to actually make use of the iconic IP. Like Yu-Gi-Oh used to have the Pokemon effect, right? Everybody knew the Dark Magician, everybody knew Red Eyes, everybody knew Blue Eyes, everybody knew the Celtic Garden. So it does have that factor. There's a reason why Dark Magician, Yugi Kaiba are still the face of the game till this day. That nostalgia bait is really strong. The reason for that is because the IP is that cool and that recognizable. So let's take advantage of that. Let's make use of it. Let's also make use and take advantage of the pacing that the game had at that time. Like if you play something like GOAT, you will see what I mean. There's a lot more back and forth that the game had at that point. We don't want to overly simplify Yu-Gi-Oh to the point where it's boring, but I do think there's a way to get away from modern Yu-Gi-Oh and still accomplish a lot of that. And I think that looking at something like GOAT is an example that it is in fact possible. I'm not saying that we should make a format exactly like GOAT. Again, this is not a reset, but take inspiration from it. And certainly, again, do not touch the rules of the game, otherwise it becomes a different game. We don't want a different game, we just want a reboot of the original game. This is what I'm talking about when I bring up rebooting the game, and this is why I make the very specific distinction about saying that it's not a reset, it's a reboot. That's what I mean. The next step and the next phase of this would be a reboot of the anime. The reboot of the anime would have to happen in conjunction with the reboot of the game, specifically so that the screen matches the physical. That is very important. It is very important, in my opinion, that what little Timmy's seeing on the TV matches what little Timmy's holding in his hands. I think that that is absolutely crucial. I know for a fact that that's why I got into Yu-Gi-Oh! And I know that that's why most people got into Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the fact that they watched the show and it was cool to play a card game that was what you were seeing on TV. And in making use of the original IP, not only because the original IP is incredible and recognizable, you're gonna get all the nostalgic 30, 40-year-old Toms back into the game. That's something that they can now and will want to do if they're kids or just get back into in general. It is now approachable and recognizable, both things that I find that are very important while also not making the game overly simple. I always find it very funny that it's either one extreme or the other, right? It's either complete caveman Yu-Gi-Oh or it has to be like modern Yu-Gi-Oh, crazy omni negates and unbreakable boards. There is a way to dial the game back a notch, make Konami a bunch of money by reprinting all these different cards and also honoring the original IP. The conversation doesn't have to happen in the extremes. Like there can be a happy medium where both of these worlds meet. And I think that that's what Yu-Gi-Oh is missing, a modernized version of their classic game, Duel Monsters 2.0. That's what I mean.